Welcome, friends, to the biggest can of worms that History Talk has ever opened and probably ever will. Why? Because everything I'm about to say is, while kind of sort of rooted in testimony, it's also rooted in yellow journalism and rumor, and we're just talking completely and utterly in hyperbole or hypotheticals. Because, well, you'll see. In his 1997 version of Titanic, James Cameron made a very, very controversial choice in one certain scene. I think you know the one. Making the choice to show an officer taking his life. It was a story up until that point had been nothing but rumors, albeit well-known and frequent rumors. But the subject of who might have done that, if any at all, was hotly discussed in the press. And though the rumors are largely discredited, Walter Lord said there are some accounts that are very similar regarding an officer in an officer coat with a weapon. Some French newspapers alluded that it was Captain Smith, others Chief Officer Wilde or Murdoch. But here's where the mystery comes in. 4 officers had weapons, and only one of them made it off the ship. In a letter to his grieving widow, Charles Lightoller assures Ada Murdoch that the rumors circulating about her husband's end in his final minutes are ridiculous, and that her husband, quote, died like a man doing his duty, and that he personally had seen her husband wash over the starboard side of the ship. That's all well and good, until you realize, while reading his British inquiry testimony, whether an omission or a lie, Lightoller would not have been able to see what happened to Murdoch in those final moments of the ship. The story was just shrugged off for a long time, and then when James Cameron put it into his 1997 movie, the family of William Murdoch became enraged. So what happened? I'm sorry to tell you, by the end of this, we're still not going to know. There's no way to know. We're going to take a look at the Murdoch conspiracy on this Titanic Month History Talk. Dear Mrs. Murdoch, I am writing on behalf of the surviving officers to express our deep sympathy in this, your awful loss. Words cannot convey our feelings, much less a letter. I deeply regret that I missed communicating with you by last mail to refute the reports that were spread in the newspapers. I was practically the last man and certainly the last officer to see Mr. Murdoch. He was then endeavoring to launch the starboard-forward collapsible boat. I had already gotten mine off the top of our quarters. You will better understand when I say that I was working the port side of the ship, and Mr. Murdoch was principally engaged on the starboard side of the ship, filling and launching the boats. Having gotten my boat down off the top of the house, and there being no time to open it, I left and ran across the starboard side, still on top of the quarters. I was practically then looking down on your husband and his men. He was working hard, personally assisting, overhauling the forward boat's fall. At this moment, the ship dived, and we were all in the water. Other reports as to the ending are absolutely false. Mr. Murdoch died like a man doing his duty. Call on us without hesitation for anything we can do for you. Yours very sincerely. Signed, C.H. Lightoller. This letter actually sold at an auction not too many years ago, but I found this on williammurdoch.net, a site that is actually dedicated to defending Murdoch against this conspiracy theory in addition to informing people about him. These rumors that Murdoch had ended his life, or in other cases, other officers, came out of a significant amount of yellow journalism, so a lot of people tended to overlook them, including author Walter Lord, who wrote the book A Night to Remember, which is mostly the definitive account on what happened that night. But as Lord found other things he had been told that night were false, including the fact that the ship went down in one piece after the discovery in 1985, he wrote The Night Lives On. And within that book, he acknowledges this story that has been circulating for many years, particularly due to 2 eyewitness accounts of 2 men who said nearly the same thing but never communicated. Reports of an officer taking his life near Collapsible A, where Murdoch would have been that night. And then you start to realize that in this letter that Lightoller wrote to Ada Murdoch, it would have been nearly impossible for him to see, if you go with either his American or British inquiry testimony, to see what he claims he saw here. William Murdoch being washed off the railing. And Walter Lord finally had to admit that it was likely that something could have happened, but we would never know for certain. This will send you down a rabbit hole. Your historic comfort character and caring about them can be exhausting. When I first got into the world of Charles Lightoller, I never knew he was such a polarizing figure. I vaguely remembered A Night to Remember from my youth, and then I remembered him from the James Cameron movie, and I was like, that guy seemed really angry and unhinged. I didn't realize that so many people had so many polarizing opinions about this man. Mostly stemming from the fact that he contradicts himself, that he underloaded the lifeboats, which we've talked about, and of course the whole Masaba conspiracy thing. Every Titanic armchair historian, including myself, has a very, very, very strong opinion about Lightoller. I've learned it. I think his flaw was not being a company man. I think he was in a sense, but I think he was also smart enough to know that this wreck was going to be the ruin of the White Star Line. He may have allowed himself to, dream and hope that he could still be the captain of the Olympic one day, but I don't think he was too surprised when it turned out that the White Star Line would not allow anyone from this tragedy to climb the ranks ever again. I think Lightoller's biggest flaw was that Lightoller liked to feel important. From the name dropping in his book to the elbows he was rubbing up against, to the way he used this same phrase in 2 letters he wrote. To Ada Murdoch, I think I was practically the last officer to see your husband. And he said a similar sentence to the colleagues who worked alongside the chief surgeon. I think I was the last officer to see him. He may very well have been, but the fact of the matter stands that once you get into his inquiry testimony when it comes to Murdoch, it would have been almost impossible for him to have seen Murdoch's end, given what he's saying in the testimony. I feel bad for him. We're the same age here, 38. His career was killed by this, and he wasn't even the one making the call. And I think it's easy for us to sit back and just comfortably say how we would have acted, while reclining in our chairs in a catastrophe. Then you actually get into one and you have to see how you would behave. So let's look at the British and American inquiry. But there's a series of questions which shows that it would have been incredibly hard for Lightoller, who was on the port side of the ship, to have seen or witnessed the end of William Murdoch. It is very difficult for me to pick a favorite Titanic inquiry between, the American and the British. The American inquiry is fantastic just because you have a senator from a landlocked state who knows nothing about boats but is insisting on handling all the lead questioning to one of the snarkiest men he's probably met in his entire life. And I fault Lightoller for none of it, because if I know we are supposed to respect authority figures in these serious situations. However, if a senator looked at me seriously and asked what the effect of an iceberg striking the Titanic was, I too would have stared at him like he was an idiot for 3 seconds before going, she sank? Like, he got in trouble for being a little snarky, but I mean, dude. Then you have the British inquiry, where there are so many ways that you can phrase a question before somebody starts contradicting themselves because the question is confusing. Because how many ways can you ask if the gangway doors were closed or open? It is insane, the number of questions. But I'm only going to be rapid firing and focusing on this one section of testimony. These rumors were so well known that people were actually asking, how was so-and-so's demeanor during the sinking of the ship? Just making sure, I think. I can't say if that's normal or not. I don't know. I've never been through any sort of inquiry such as this. I hope I never am. But let's talk about the final moments of the ship. In his letter to Ada, Lightoller says he's on the port side, he crosses across the top of the officer's quarters, looks down, and sees Murdoch. That part, fine. He had just gotten B down. B would be the collapsible that he would end up next to when it was overturned in the water, that he would commandeer. Murdoch is working on releasing A. In his letter to Ada, he implies they all end up in the water kind of around the same time. The ship shifted and we all went forward. In both hearings, he's explicitly saying, I only really know about the port side because I could not see starboard from where I was. Now, he probably did cross up there to help get collapsible B down. But this is where a lot of people point out that Lightoller starts going a little off where he would have been able to see Murdoch. As I say, I was on top of the officers' quarters and there was nothing more to be done. And the ship took a dive. And I turned face forward and also took a dive. From which side? From on top. From midship. Midship. Now, he probably would have been a little more forward than midship from where he says he ended up against the grate. But in his autobiography, Lightoller specifically says, the ship lilted port. Witnesses also say this. So they didn't go off at the same time. Lightoller fell off first, toward the front of the ship. Now, a lot of people say that the American inquiry was so kind of poorly done, it's difficult to tell, and there could be some misconception in the testimony of where Lightoller is located in that section. Yeah, he's on the middle of the boat, but not necessarily midship. He could have been more towards the front. But it gets more specific here, and this is where I think I noticed that omission, basically. And boy, I can give you the exact question number. Day 12 of the British Inquiry, question 14047. That's the question number. Just for an idea of how many questions are going on here. Okay. What you need to know is that prior to this in the testimony, Lights is saying that he could not see anything happening really on the starboard side. He knew only about the port side. That's all he could testify to. Because until the end, when he peeps over and sees Murdoch, his focus has been only on the port side, which is where he was. But now you get here, and this is where I think I was like, okay, I will be reading some of these and then I will paraphrase others. Then tell us your last minute or two on the ship. What did you do? I went across to the starboard side of the officers' quarters, on top of the officers' quarters, to see if I could do anything on starboard side. Well, I could not. Coming over to the starboard side, on the roof of the officers' quarters, could you see any other officers? I saw the first officer working at the falls of the starboard emergency boat, obviously with the intention of overhauling them and hooking them up to the collapsible boat on their side. That is collapsible A he is talking about. Murdoch is working on collapsible A. They've just had the trouble getting B down. The other collapsible boat, yes. That would be Mr. Murdoch, yes. Were there others helping him? There were a number round helping. Then what happened? Well, she seemed to take a bit of a dive, and I just walked into the water. In his autobiography, he wrote very specifically about the moment he had to jump in, saying it felt like a bulkhead had given way. And there are so many other witnesses to this moment that they note that the ship tilts port first. He's on the port side. And what happens is he just kind of has to fall forward. The ship tilted to port. He then swims around the front of the ship toward the masthead. He says he's not really sure why he did that. He was cold. And initially he thought maybe he was just trying to get to something to hold on to. Then he realized it was foolish. So he began to try to cross the swim to the starboard side. And it's here he becomes stuck. Why was he trying to swim to starboard? Maybe because the ship was unevenly sinking. But if starboard was still above water at this point, would he have seen Murdoch get washed away? He makes no mention of Murdoch or seeing Murdoch's end. They just move on. This was the moment I realized he would have been underwater when whatever happened to Murdoch happened. You really have two sources that Walter Lord believed to be the most reliable when it came to witnesses of this alleged incident and the reasoning that so many people believed it was Murdoch. The testimony was from George Reams and Eugene Daly. They were passengers. They had similar stories. They didn't know each other. But even in their testimony, there were inconsistencies. But they had the most common thread. That's what Walter Lord noticed. That there was an officer who was starting to lose his cool near collapsible A that ended with either him, if you believe the reports, hurting someone else and then hurting himself. That just happened to be the last spot that Murdoch was known to be in. And what do I think happened? I don't know. I lean toward no, it was not Murdoch. I don't lean toward the fact that it was an impossibility that someone took their life in that crew. I don't know. It shouldn't have mattered. But by that standard of that time period, it did. But here are the hardest questions I had to ask myself while researching this. And it's been more shockingly emotional than I thought. Which is, I'm an emotional person. We know this. Okay, do I think that Charles Lightoller saw what happened to William Murdoch, his friend? No. In his letter to Ada, he said that they all ended up in the water at the same time, or kind of implied that. But the boat shifted port first, and he neither mentions seeing Murdoch. He just says, I walked into the water because of the shift. It went forward, so did I. The next moments are him swimming for his life and being pulled against the grate, and we all know the rest here. Did Lightoller know something about Murdoch? Could be, but I doubt it. In that chaos, how could anyone have known what happened to anybody else? Do I think that Lightoller lied to Ada Murdoch in that letter? Absolutely, I do. And, she was not given a death certificate for her husband. She was given a termination of contract from the White Star Line. The reason given for the termination of contract was supposed drowning. And I'm not even been able to really find what would have happened had it said something unsavory. Not completely. I've seen lots of rumors, but do I think Lightoller lied to Ada Murdoch? I do. But it was a lie of kindness. A lie of, I saw your husband working until the end and him being swept over the side, because it was 1,000 times kinder than these cruel rumors. There's nothing else to it, I think, but that. A lie born of kindness.